Okay, we are now in our very last unit in anatomy, 120, anatomy physiology. And what we're going to be looking at here is retrocochlear anatomy and physiology. Retro means behind. So I think you've gone through the eye of the needle, and that is the cochlea. That's the most difficult organ to understand in hearing. From now we are going up the 8th nerve, and we'll study today, we'll look mostly at the 8th nerve. Next week, we'll concentrate more on the brain stem. And I'd like to show you some CT scans and some MRIs of the brain and the brain stem too. Why not? And that way you'll get to see it for yourselves. And but without any further ado here, I'll share screen and we'll pull up our notes first. And those would be right here. So we're looking at the 8th nerve and central auditory nervous system, CANS, C-A-N-S, central auditory nervous system. We'll look mostly at that next week. Lassen Woodford has your titles or your chapters there, chapter 4. The pages in Martin changes his textbook every year or so. I mean, they keep updating. So the version of textbook I have from Martin is from way back, so don't trust me on it, but I'd look in the table of contents and look for the 8th nerve and central auditory nervous system in his book. But here we go in our notes, looking at CNS, central nervous system, and then below that you'll see PNS, peripheral nervous system. Now what are these two things? Well, as you know, when we say the word nerves, what do? They connect with muscles or glands. Nerves cause either muscles to secrete, glands to secrete, or muscles to contract. So when you're looking at the central nervous system, think of two things, the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, really your brain has a tail and it goes all the way down your back. Your spinal cord really is part of your brain. Okay, it's just the part of your brain that has left the skull or descended from the cranium. So there's a hole in the bottom of your skull called the magnum foramen, F-O-R-A-M-E-M, magnum, big, foramen means hole, big hole. Magnum foramen, the bottom of your skull, your brain stem goes through there and extends down your backbone all the way down to your rear end. So when you're thinking of CNS, brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system, PNS, is everything else, any other nerve in your body. Okay? The nerves go into your hands, your legs, your feet, wherever. So central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, everything else. So now let's read about what everything else is. And what does the CNS do above there? The brain and spinal cord controls behavior. What comes out is different from what went in. Oh yeah, now think about it. You have two pathways, afferent, brain going, efferent, brain leaving. So what kind of messages go to your brain? Sensory messages, smell, taste, vision, touch, hearing. And then what leaves your central nervous system is commands back to your muscles to do things in reaction to the behavior. Okay, so what comes out is different from what went in. And we call that difference behavior. Okay, that's what psychologists study. Reasons why you do things. So sensory information is afferent, motor information is efferent, motor being muscles. So back to our notes here. You have three parts, or you got a bunch of stuff in your PNS. Spinal nerves, 31 pairs. Cranial nerves, 12 pairs. Smaller nerves as well. Let's look at a picture. Okay, here's a picture of it. Here's your spinal nerves, 31 pairs. Okay, cranial nerves, 12 pairs, usually listed in Roman numerals. So this is your spinal cord in your skull. And the spinal cord in your skull is called the brain stem. And your spinal cord, from where my cursor is here to where it is here, is about 1 inch long. So your brain stem is about 1 inch long. It's not very big, okay? It's just it's about as thick as a pencil, maybe a little thicker. Don't puncture it, you'll die. And then as this brain stem leaves the skull, it descends as your spinal cord. Back to your notes here. Spinal cord then is actually part of your brain. The brain has a long tail. Many neural messages go along nerves to the spinal cord and back again. So let's look at that. Whoops, spinal cord and back again. So here you might have a nerve from your leg going to your spinal cord and then right back out again. In other words, it never went up to your brain. You never thought about it. And you can think of an instance like that when you think about touching a hot stove. Your hand instantly recoils back. That message never went up to your brain. That message went to your spinal cord, up your arm, to your spinal cord, and right back out again. You never thought about it for an instant. It's called a reflex. Anything that does not involve your cranium, like your thought, your thinking of your brain, is a reflex. And you can think of another example from what you've learned in anatomy class, your acoustic reflex. Loud sounds going in your ear and the tensor tympani muscle and stapedius muscle contracting. Those messages are involuntary. You didn't think about them. You couldn't stop them. They reach your brain stem and go right back out the 5th nerve and right back out the 7th cranial nerves, back to the tensor tympani muscle and your stapedius muscles to contract. Again, a reflex. So messages that go from the body to the spinal cord or from the body to the brain stem, which is just the spinal cord inside your skull, and then right back out, those are called reflexes. So you're at the doctor getting a test and the doctor has you cross your legs and the doctor taps your knee with a hammer, with a rubber hammer, and your leg shoots out. I don't know what reflex that's called again. I'm not a doctor. But anyway, that's a reflex too. The message never went to your brain. It went to your spinal cord and right back out again. So the tap of the hammer, the feeling against your knee went up your thigh, to your backbone, to your spinal cord, and right back out to kick your leg. Reflex. So you can start thinking about afferent and efferent in a real different way here. Many neural messages go along nerves to spinal cord and back again. They never reach the cortex of your brain. These are called reflexes. For example, the knee reflex, instant recoil from a hot stove, acoustic reflex. Geez, you'd think I wrote these. Neural messages that actually go all the way to the brain. Reactions involving conscious thought and awareness. Those are different. Yep, they still are afferent and efferent, but think about primitive and more advanced things. Let's see if we can just kind of give a little bit of a preview here. Let's just find, let's stick to this picture here for a sec. Now, you've got your brain stem here, and you've got all your pairs of cranial nerves.
I don't have the picture.
Oh, you don't? Okay, thanks for telling me. Let's go see the picture. Okay. Okay, do you see the notes here?
Nope.
Okay. Do you see me?
I see you.
Okay, share screen. I gotta find a way to kind of, there we go. Now, if I hit share screen, can you see the picture now, Karen?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Keep me in check. I gotta behave. Okay, so here's the brain stem. And look at the bottom of here, this gray area. That's called your cerebellum. That's a part of your brain. And that's above your brain stem. And that controls fine motor movement. We'll look more at that next week, but that doesn't have much to do with hearing, okay? It controls fine motor movement. Think about sewing. Think about delicate finger movements and fine control of walking behavior. Someone with damage to the cerebellum is going to have a lot of problems walking. He's going to stagger. He's going to walk like he's drunk. He can walk, but he doesn't have much coordination. Sometimes people with cerebellar problems are picked up for being drunk, and they're not. Now, if you look at this big black area here, that's your cerebrum. That's the largest part. So what you're looking at in terms of the brain here is you're looking at it from the bottom up. So this is the base of your brain, and you're looking at it from the bottom up. Let's see if I can show you another picture of the brain. We'll just move on over here. Let's see, I'll find you a good picture from more from the side. Okay, let's just go more from the side of your, okay, well, here's one picture of it. Now, this is a side view, and they call this a sagittal view. It's like I sliced myself right down the center of the head and turned it sideways. Here's your brain stem, this thing with a weird bulb on it, and this thing here, that's your brain stem. Here's your cerebellum for fine motor movement, and this is your cerebrum, the wrinkled area. And that's where conscious thought would take place. Okay? Now tell me, can you see the notes that I'm pulling up here?
Yes.
Good. Okay, great. Okay. Now when you think about the first time you've tied a shoe, you were a little kid, and your mommy or daddy said, make 2 bunny ears, and you turned them, and you really had to think about it. You thought about it. But finally, as you learn how to tie shoes, you really hardly even think about it, do you? You just sort of do it. And it's like the first time that you've ever gone to someone's house, and they're giving you directions, and you're driving in from another city, and you're thinking about you're looking at the map. You are involving your cerebrum. You're involving your whole brain. But as you get used to it, your brain says, oh, that's kind of boring. I can relegate that more toward the brain stem. I can relegate that task to a more primitive part of my brain, more of the automatic, just do it. Like when you tie your shoes, you don't even think about it anymore. That's because your brain, if they were able to take a PET scan or a brain activity scan of a child tying his or her shoe, the whole brain would be lit up. If they could take a PET scan of an adult tying her or his shoe, the activity would be taking place lower down, more in the primitive areas of your brain. So when you think of the brain stem, think primitive brain. The brain you need to have to breathe, the brain that controls your blood temperature, the brain that controls your heartbeat, all those primitive but necessary functions. And then as you go up, 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 your brain gets larger and larger, but actually that's not controlling your blood temperature and your really essential stuff. That's just pure thought and associations. It's so smart, it's the one that decides to create wars. Stupid things, people behavior, okay? The brain stem never does that, but the really advanced brain does. So at any rate, let's see here, I'll start sharing screen again and hit here. Okay, read with me now the typical neuron building block. Let's look at a typical neuron, because remember when we talked about the 8th nerve, we said it had lots and lots of fibers. It's like a rope with thousands and thousands of fibers all twisted. And remember we talked tuning curves this morning in acoustics class? Well, take one of those fibers, one of the 30,000 fibers of your nerve, and it's called a neuron. So when we look at a neuron fiber, we'll go here. Here's a typical neuron, okay? And look at what the pieces and parts it's got. This one's called multipolar, and it's most likely an efferent motor neuron, because motor neurons that are efferent, that go from the brain or brain stem or spinal cord to the muscles, are usually multipolar. And we'll look at its pieces and parts. It's got a nucleus. That's what feeds it. And then it's got all these little arms. Look at these little arms. They look like tree branches. Those are called dendrites. Those pick up information from the neuron next to it. And it sends information, follow my cursor, down this long arm. And that long arm is called an axon. And it ends in these little buttons. Now, when you're looking at the axon, do you see, I'll bring it closer up here, you can even see it looks like they have hot dog buns on it. And the hot dog buns are fat. They're sometimes called lipid, L-I-P-I-D, lipid cells. Those enable messages to be sent down the fiber. In fact, if you follow my little star, my cursor here, the messages go from here to here, to here, to here, to here, and down. When you lose the fatty fibers, these hot dog buns, messages can't jump down the fiber. And you have what's called MS, multiple sclerosis. You have lost the fatty fiber that lines the axons of your neurons. And sometimes they advise a ketogenic diet, high in milk, fat, butter, cheese, anything to get more fat into this person's body with the hope that new lipid cells like this can grow. Okay? So it's really interesting here. Now here is categories of terms of nerves and tracts and ganglia and nuclei. Look at these four words: nerves, tracts, ganglia, nuclei. If I go back a slide here, there's white areas and gray areas. The white areas are the axons. The gray areas is this, what I'm circling here. Okay, it's not covered with fatty tissue. It's gray. And that's why your nervous system has white matter and gray matter. The white matter is the lipid fat covering cells that enable transmissions down the neuron fiber, and the gray areas are the cell bodies. And they're not covered with fat tissue. The fatty tissue has a name besides lipid. It's called myelin. Myelin. M-Y-E-L-I-N. Myelin. That's the fatty hot dog buns along the axon of the neuron. Okay, so myelin is white, and the cell bodies of the neuron fibers are gray because they're not covered with fatty tissue. Now here's the categorization in a box. Nerves, top left, are bundles of white axons in the peripheral nervous system. Tracts, top right, are bundles of white axons in the central nervous system. So, when you look at the two bottom boxes, you're looking at gray matter. Ganglia are bundles of gray cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Now, can you think of an example of ganglia that we've covered in our course? Sure, spiral ganglia. Because the eighth nerve, now when you think of the eighth nerve, here's a little quiz question. Eighth nerve, is it part of the peripheral nervous system or part of the central nervous system? And you'd have to think, what was the central nervous system? Well, that's the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, is the eighth nerve the brain? No. Is it the spinal cord? Nope. So guess what? The eighth nerve, even though it's in the cranium, is the peripheral nervous system. And what do you call its bundle of cell bodies? Spiral ganglia. When you look at the bottom right box, you've got your last of the four terms, nuclei. Nuclei are bundles of gray cell bodies in the central nervous system. Bundles of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, bundles of cell bodies in the central nervous system. And then the top two boxes, bundles of white axons in the peripheral nervous system, are called nerves. And to the top right, bundles of white axons in the central nervous system are called tracts. So when you think about it, you might have an example of a tract. Might be your, what do you call it, cortical spinal tract. You think cortical, cortex to spinal cord. Wow, that would be a long bundle of white fibers, wouldn't it? It'd be at least a foot long. Okay, cortical spinal tract. So all these different little terms. Now here's two nerves, neuron fibers, talking to each other, one on the left and one on the right. And you can see the gray area would be where I'm circling. And the gray area would also be these long dendrites here. But the axon would be white matter, and it's sending its messages down to the end. Now look at the little button all of a sudden. And that little button is one of these guys. See these little buttons at the end? Well, this little button here is going to open up and send transmitters across to get picked up by this one. And it's going to send information this way. So read what it says here. For an impulse to continue from one neuron to another, it must cross the synaptic cleft at a synapse. So let's look at that. Here's one of the buttons. And here's the little synaptic vesicles. And it's going to poof, pop open right here, sending its messages across to the next neuron fiber. Now when neurotransmitters fall into medical problems, you get Parkinson's disease. You get Huntington's chorea. You get ALS. All these weird, tragic kind of neural problems are problems with neurotransmitters jumping across the clefts to get to the next neuron. So when you start studying nerves and nerve fibers, you start crossing into other disciplines in medicine, and you start running into things that are really wild. It's like all these different pathologies. But for now, let's just stick to Snickers here. Let's look at our notes. And you can see the notes. There's those 4 things that were in the boxes that I showed you there. Let's move down the page. And oh, by the way, put a star by these things because those are very, very examinable, quizzable, testable types of items. Okay, just hints from Heloise. Okay, myelin, white fatty sheath that lines a neuron fiber. It allows electrical transmission along the axons. Gray matter is unmyelinated neuron cell bodies. And then you have your bundles and your groups. Here's all the stuff we talked about in the boxes. Okay? So in the top here, this area here that's bold-faced, this area here is talking to you about your typical pieces and parts of a neuron, of a neuron, as you can see in this picture here. So when you're looking at this picture here, take a look at your notes. That's what I've grayed out right here. When you're looking at this section of your notes here, what we need to look at in terms of your PowerPoint slides, whoops, not that, I'll show you that in a bit, is over here. Here, that's their categorization of terms. I just put them in a box here, and over here they're just outlined in the notes. Same thing. Now let's look at our 8th nerve. Where does it fit in the whole scheme of things? Well, the 8th nerve is part of the peripheral nervous system, and it's bipolar. This doesn't mean that it gets very happy and very depressed. It doesn't have any type of psychological problem there. Bipolar means what is shown here in the PowerPoint slide. Bipolar. When you look at this particular PowerPoint slide here, whoa, okay, on the right is a bipolar neuron. That's what the 8th nerve fibers look like. There's a hair cell, inner hair cell, because the 8th nerve is mostly in contact with inner hair cell. And look what bipolar neurons have. One axon here, cell body in the middle, and another axon here. Whereas multipolar on the left, cell body with all these dendrites, and then a long axon ending in synaptic buttons. Now, bipolar neurons also end in terminal buttons, but bipolar simply means it's a sensory neuron. All sensory neurons are bipolar. Motor neurons are multipolar. Bipolar, multipolar. Here's another picture of multipolar on the top. You can see it's got a cell body here with a bunch of dendrites and then one long axon. And then in the middle, you're looking at a bipolar neuron. Long arm, cell body, long arm. Okay, that's what the eighth nerve would have. That would be like an optical nerve, an auditory nerve, a balance nerve. Okay, so these are neuron fibers. Now this one here we won't really cover. This is kind of, we won't worry about that one. But it's got a cell body in the middle and a long arm too. But the cell body is a little bit off to the side. But it's the middle one here. That's what the eighth nerve is. Now, if I can go out of here and look at where we are in our PowerPoints and look at the eighth nerve here. Look at how you got 30,000 neuron fibers. And each of the neuron fibers is bipolar. And again, I'll repeat, sensory nerves and sensory neurons are bipolar. They are afferent. Motor neurons are multipolar. They are efferent. Good. Now we've got it. Let's look at our notes here about the eighth nerve. Sensory afferent neurons go to the central nervous system. For example, olfactory, smell, vision, hearing. They are relatively few in number, found only in mammals. Motor neurons are multipolar. They are efferent because they return from the central auditory nervous system back to muscles or glands. There are more of these. And then tiny interneurons include everything between the above. There's about 1 trillion of these in your brain. And these serve to integrate sensory experience, and they organize muscular behavior. Yikes. Let's look at the anatomy and physiology of the eighth nerve. From the spiral ganglia through the internal auditory meatus to the brainstem. From the spiral ganglia through what's called the IAM. Now we know what the external auditory meatus is, your ear canal. Internal auditory meatus is the tunnel that your eighth nerve goes through to get to your brainstem. It's the tunnel that your eighth nerve goes through to leave your cochlea and get to your brainstem. How long is the eighth nerve? 1 inch long. The eighth nerve is the shortest of all your cranial nerves. The shortest. Okay? You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves. The eighth nerve is the shortest. It meets the brain stem at the cochlear nucleus, located at the pontomedullary junction. Ooh, okay, let's just see what the Sam Hill that is. All right. Let's see. Eighth nerve. Now here's a picture of the internal auditory meatus. And this guy's got an eighth nerve tumor. We'll talk a little bit about that, okay? Here's your eighth nerve. It's leaving the cochlea. So it's got 2 arms, and one arm is longer than the other. The longer arm goes from the spiral ganglia to the brainstem. The short arm goes from the spiral ganglia to the inner hair cells. Okay, so from inner hair cells to your spiral ganglia, which is the cell body, and then the other axon leaves the spiral ganglia and goes to your brain stem. Now here's a brain stem. When you're looking here, this guy's got a tumor. Look at this great big ball over here. and it's squeezing his whole brain stem. It's pushing it over to the side. The cochlear nucleus is a bunch of gray cell bodies in the central nervous system, which is in the low brainstem. In the low brainstem. So let's see, if we draw it here, there you go. Here's your brainstem. Let's look at the eighth nerve. Follow the cursor right there. And where does it meet the brainstem? Right there. Now this lower part of your brainstem is called the medulla. M-E-D-U-L-L-A, medulla. It continues down and leaves the skull and becomes the spinal cord. Medulla. It's the lowest part of your brain stem. The eighth nerve meets the brain stem at the junction of the medulla and the pons. This big ball here, that's called the pons. P-O-N-S. Pons. And then the top part of your brain stem is called the midbrain. So let's look at it from the side. I'll give you a side view of this. Here's a side view. The medulla is the bottom. The pons is this round part here. And then the top of your brain stem is called your midbrain. So midbrain, pons, medulla. Midbrain, pons, medulla. I'm giving you a bit of a heads up for next week. We're just kind of, so that when you hear these words next week, you'll, oh yeah, I've heard those before. Good. Where does the eighth nerve meet at the brainstem? Right here. At the junction of the pons and the medulla. So it's called the pontomedullary junction. Eighth nerve meets the brainstem at the pontomedullary junction. Just to help give you some of the words there. And look at here, the eighth nerve is tonotopic, with axons that are twisted like a rope. Fibers from the cochlea apex, low frequency hair cells, those are wrapped inside the eighth nerve. Fibers from the base of the cochlea tend to be more wrapped around the outside of the eighth nerve. So when we go to our picture here, and we look up here, you are looking at this guy right here. So you can see that from the top of the cochlea, the eighth nerve fibers are in the inside of the eighth nerve. From the bottom wide base of the cochlea, the fibers are wrapped more around the outside of the eighth nerve. Here's another picture of the eighth nerve leaving the cochlea. See these little balls, these little tiny things here? You can call those the spiral ganglia. They're wrapped all the way around, all the way up to the top. And you can see that the fibers from the base of the cochlea are wrapped around the outside more, whereas the fibers from the apex of the cochlea are more on the inside. So just like the cochlea, the eighth nerve is tonotopic. Specific frequencies are represented in specific places. Here's a picture of a spiral ganglion. Now look at all the tiny little cell bodies inside each spiral ganglion. Thousands of little neuron cell bodies, and then one axon goes this way to the inner hair cells, and the other axon leaves here and goes to the brainstem. So it's a bipolar neuron with a cell body in the middle and two long arms. Actually, in the eighth nerve, one arm is much longer than the other. Okay, but as opposed to multipolar, it doesn't have a whole bunch of arms like a spider. It's mainly two things, one arm here, one arm here. These are tuning curves that we studied this morning in 110, so I don't need to go over these very much. Tuning curves just show you that the eighth nerve is tonotopic. Specific frequencies are represented in specific places. The tips or bottoms of the tuning curves is called the characteristic frequency. That's the frequency where least decibels is needed to make that neuron fiber fire and send its message. So it shows you that each neuron fiber is specifically tuned to one frequency. And that would make sense because eighth nerve fibers are attached to inner hair cells. And inner hair cells are arrayed along the basilar membrane in a real order like piano keys. This is tuning curves from normal hearing and from sensory neural loss. We don't need to go into this very much because we covered this in 110 as well. But you can see the tuning curve, the black one is showing you a normal tuning curve from a normal eighth nerve fiber, and the red is showing you a tuning curve from damaged hair cells. And now the tuning curve is more elevated, meaning more decibels is required to get that neuron fiber to fire, but also other frequencies besides just one can make that neuron fiber fire. So it's more broadly tuned, which means it's no good. That's a drag. It means lots of different frequencies can make that neuron fiber fire. The frequency resolution is not as good. Now this gets a little bit odd, so I won't go there. All right, so now let's go to look at our notes and read. Top of page 2. The axons of the eighth nerve are unmyelinated inside the cochlea. They only become myelinated after the spiral ganglia. In English, this means that only one arm of the eighth nerve fibers is covered with fatty myelin. The other arm, leaving the spiral ganglia and going to the inner hair cells, is not myelinated. That whole arm is gray. Weird, huh? The 30,000 afferent fibers come mostly from 3,000 inner hair cells. Basically, then, there's about 10 eighth nerve fibers touching each inner hair cell. The cell bodies are located in the spiral ganglia. Olivocochlear bundle is a thin nerve running right along the eighth nerve, but in the opposite direction. It's a separate bundle of only 1,800 efferent fibers that come from all the outer hair cells, or that go to all the outer hair cells. So the cell bodies of the olivocochlear bundle are located inside the brainstem at an area called the superior olivary complex, SOCs. Jot that down right here because next week we'll talk about that. Cell bodies of the olivocochlear bundle, which is a thin nerve, a bunch of fibers, but only 1,800 of them, and they leave the brain stem, an area called the superior olivary, think of olives, but they don't have a pimento, superior olivary complex, SOCs. Those are also in the brain stem. So you can see that the cell bodies of those neuron fibers are located in the central nervous system, whereas the cell bodies of the eighth nerve are located in the cochlea. Interesting. They go opposite directions. One afferent, one's efferent. One ends at the inner hair cells, the other one terminates at the outer hair cells. Then you have this whole middle portion over here, this whole long portion here. We don't need to spend that much time on this because we've covered so much of this in acoustics this morning. Besides, most of this stuff is just stuff I won't ask you to know really. You need to know that the eighth nerve has 30,000 nerve fibers and that each nerve fiber has its own tuning curve. You need to know what the axes of a tuning curve is. The horizontal axis is frequency. The vertical axis is decibels required to get the neuron fiber to fire. And you need to know what CF is. That's the characteristic frequency. That's the downward point on the tuning curve. It shows the frequency where the decibel level, the least is required to get that neuron fiber to fire. A different frequency tone would have to have a more intensity to get that same neuron fiber to fire. Enough on that. Next. And we talked about the fact that they're asymmetrical. Covered that in 110. Okay? We've shown how how the active traveling wave is more sharp, okay, more dull and rounded with outer hair cell damage, blah, blah. Same thing happens with eighth nerve fibers, blah, blah. Heard it, got the t-shirt, been there before. Okay, keep going down here. Let's talk about pathology of the eighth nerve. This is where we want to talk. This deals with our field. What is the main pathology of the eighth nerve? The main pathology of the eighth nerve is called retrocochlear pathology. It's a tumor. And tumors of the eighth nerve are almost always unilateral. They're one ear or the other ear. They're almost never bilateral. So one of the red flags that all HISs study is unilateral sensory neural loss. So I'll stop sharing here for just a sec, and we'll talk about this. This is a serious pathology. This one will kill you. It's not a malignant tumor. It's a benign tumor. It's very small, but the internal auditory meatus is so thin. It's not much wider than a needle. It's just a thin hole. So if an eighth nerve tumor forms on the eighth nerve, it's got nowhere to go because it's going through a tiny tunnel of bone, and bone doesn't give. So when a tumor grows along the eighth nerve, all it can do is spread this way like my fingers are doing, until it reaches the brain stem. And as soon as it leaves the tunnel, it opens up. Then it can grow to be the size of an egg. And that's what twists the whole brain stem to the side. I'll show you pictures of it in just a bit. But eighth nerve tumors are not common. They're only at the rate of about 1 in 100,000 people. So Karen, how many people live in the city where you live?
Good grief, I have no idea.
Yeah, how many, but if you lived in a city of 100,000 people, there would be one person that had an eighth nerve tumor. If you lived in a city that had 1 million people, you'd have maybe 10 people that had an eighth nerve tumor. So they're not common. It's not a common tumor, but it's got to be taken out. It will kill you. They have to go. I'll share screen and show you pictures now of what they are and what they can look like. So we'll go to our PowerPoint slide here. An eighth nerve tumor I'm showing you here grows. It's small, but once it leaves the internal auditory meatus, it can get big. And notice it's now involving the 7th cranial nerve as well. So now the person's going to notice a tingling in his or her cheek, some paralysis in the cheek. Okay, so other problem, but look what it's doing to that brainstem. It's completely twisting it. And notice how in the brainstem, white matter is on the outside and gray matter is on the inside. When you get to your brain, that order reverses. White matter is on the inside, gray matter is on the outside. And I'll show you in CAT scans and MRIs in that next week. We'll take a look at that. But when you take a cross-section of the eighth nerve, here's a cross-section, and this is the internal auditory meatus. Okay? You're taking a cross-section. You're going to see the 7th cranial nerve runs through it. You're going to see the auditory portion, the vestibular portion, and you can see here how the lower frequencies are more inside. 1,000 hertz is more here. 2,000 hertz is more toward the outside. 6,000 hertz is way more toward the outside. Here's another, more of a schematic picture of the same thing. Facial nerve, 7th. Vestibular portion. Vestibular portion here. Here's an auditory portion. And look at the 8th nerve tumor squeezing against. And all of this white outside here is bone. There's nowhere for anything to grow. I mean, it's squeezed. So that tumor is going to stretch. Now, here's what audiologists do. It's called auditory brain stem response. They put electrodes on the head. One on this earlobe, one on this earlobe, one right between the eyes, and another one right here. And then they'll put headphones on. And they'll have things come out of the headphones like they're called clicks. And they'll come out really fast. And the audiologist will look for the brain waves to start appearing on the screen, on the monitor. And when you start doing that, that's called auditory brainstem response, ABR. And you're checking the 8th nerve, which is 1 inch long, and you're checking the brain stem, which is 1 inch long. So it's kind of like the letter L. You're looking this way and this way. So when you're looking at the ABR, we'll share screen here again, and I'll show you more what it looks like. Now, if you've got an 8th nerve tumor, okay, first of all, they use the ABR to test babies. Because look at this, in the right ear, in the left ear, at 80 dB, you got 5 bumps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And bumps 1 and 2 are from the 8th nerve. This is from where the 8th nerve leaves the cochlea, spiral ganglia. And wave number 2 is from where the 8th nerve meets the brainstem. And wave number 3 is from the superior olives. I'll talk more next week. And then waves 4 and 5 are from the brainstem above that. Now, when they make the sound softer, and then softer, and then softer, the waves begin to disappear, but you can still see a bump, peak 5. And they go, hey, this baby can hear in the right ear. Let's do the left ear, same thing. The infant's got pretty good hearing. All the way down to 20, we still saw waves. The other purpose of doing ABR is looking for tumors. So here's a person that has a tumor. The right ear, no problem. The left ear has a problem. Look at this. The right ear at 80 decibels, you see all the 5 bumps. At 60, you see the bumps. At 30, you still see a bump. Look at the left ear. At 90, look at how far apart the waves are. They don't look at all like these do in the right ear. And at 80, the wave is about gone. At 70, it's gone. And they go, ooh, that's very strange. That is indicative of an 8th nerve tumor. Refer to an ear, nose, and throat doctor. So when you've got a client in your office that has talked to you, and it might be a mother of 3 kids, she's 30 years old, and she may say, yeah, you know what, over the past half a year, I can't hear out of my right ear very well. And you'll take a case history and you'll say, do you have an ear infection? You'll look in the ear, the eardrum looks normal. You'll do a hearing test and the right ear might have a little bit of hearing loss, not much. But the lady's going to be saying, but I can barely talk on the phone. Speech is really unclear. And that's a symptom of 8th nerve tumor as well. Speech becomes very unclear. Your speech recognition. Now, Karen, I'm going to ask you, do you ever do speech testing when you're doing a hearing test? Does that fall under your purview yet?
I haven't done it yet. No.
Okay. Speech testing, one of the speech tests is called speech discrimination. And you'll learn about it in audiometry. You'll be saying to your client, say the word, and I'm going to cover my face, tree, say the word, wall, say the word, ground. So then the person has to repeat. So you're never saying, see the big black cat, no context. Say the word, cup. And the person with an 8th nerve tumor is going to have abnormal difficulty telling you what the word is, even though the hearing lost by the 8th nerve tumor might even be 20 decibels. Not much at all. But it's unilateral sensory neural loss is a red flag. And that's when an HIS has to refer, because you want to rule out an 8th nerve tumor. And if you've done a hearing test and it's not a conductive loss, the person has not reported any difficulty or pain, because it doesn't hurt. Tumors don't hurt. But maybe a facial numbness, ringing in the ear, a bit of dizziness at times. and difficulty hearing on the phone in that ear, and the person's young and it just happens over the course of about a half a year, red flag, refer. Refer to an audiologist to do an ABR, or refer to an ear, nose, and throat for a CAT scan or an MRI, because you want to get that eighth nerve tumor out, because it will kill you. I'm going to read you a story now. We'll finish today about the eighth nerve and what we're going to do in this particular topic. Can you see the screen, Karen? Are you good with that?
I see you.
You see me. Oh boy, here I'm doing that again. Okay, here we go. Let's see if we can share a screen here. And okay, whoops, I want to be able to do that. Okay, do you see the notes here, or do you still see me?
Just you.
Okay, working on it. Nope, don't want that one either. Just trying to find it. Okay, see if I can find out how to do this. Ah, there we are. Okay, share screen and share this and share. Now I imagine you can see the PowerPoint slide, right?
Yeah.
Good stuff. Okay, I'm going to read a little story here about eighth nerve tumor, because this is a real trip. Whoops. There we go. And I'm going to blow it up and talk. Acoustic neuroma, the stealth tumor. Now you can tell this was written in Canada because the word tumor has O-U-R in it. That's us Canucks, we do that with the words harbor, color. We just stick that little U in there. Acoustic neuroma caught our family completely by surprise despite the slow progression of the symptoms and an equally slow diagnostic process. In 1992, my wife Linda began to experience equilibrium problems and loss of hearing in her left ear. Our family doctor speculated it might be an inner ear problem, suggested she reduce salt and caffeine intake, referred her for an ABR, here they call it a BAIR, brain, nonetheless. The test, which typically should have detected the tumor, was inconclusive. Within a few weeks, the symptoms got better, and we assumed the salt and caffeine had been the cause. In the spring of 1994, she began to notice a loss of sensation in her teeth, gums, and tongue. Doctors suggested she check with a dentist, who referred her to an oral surgeon. Took weeks of appointments, referrals, and all kinds of stuff. Finally, she got referred to an ear, nose, and throat specialist who sent her for a CAT scan. It revealed a 3 centimeter, now in Canada, centimeters, 2.5 equals an inch. It revealed an inch-long tumor growing from her auditory canal inward along the auditory nerve, inward toward the brainstem. We were stunned by the diagnosis. Linda, our 2 teenage daughters, were looking for a simple explanation, but no. The neurologist told us more about her acoustic tumor, and we received support, blah, blah, blah. An acoustic tumor is a benign tumor that grows around the nerve sheath from the inner ear through an opening in the skull toward the brainstem. Okay, the tumor slowly puts pressure on the nerve, all kinds of other things. If untreated, the pressure on the brainstem can cause death. Statistically, 1 in 100,000 people in North America are diagnosed each year. Surgical removal is the thing. The most common, look where my cursor is, translabyrinthine, means they go right through the cochlea, so now you're deaf in the ear. Her tumor was relatively large, so this was the recommended procedure. This operation lasted 9 hours. They cut behind her left ear to gain access to the tumor. When they found it, they separated the tumor from the nerve sheath, carefully removing it piece by piece. In her case, during the last stages after they removed most of the tumor, a blood vessel started to bleed. Doctors later told us they had to cauterize this to avoid the possibility of a stroke. The result, we were soon to learn, was partial face paralysis due to traumatization of the 7th cranial nerve, which is right beside the 8th. Was it permanent or temporary? She had terrible headaches, poor balance, lack of energy. She had to deal with loss of hearing in her left ear. She had a significant amount of control of the left face had gone. She worked diligently in physiotherapy to improve this. Her facial paralysis proved to be one of the biggest obstacles. Horrible. Stop sharing. I'll just make a face to you. Imagine if you had seventh nerve paralysis, you've got Bell's palsy. So you imagine a young woman walking into the grocery store. Now, I'd like to get some bananas. Deaf in the ear and face pulled way over to one side. Sometimes they do surgery where they can actually, they mess around with this and they can make it so that if you touch the tip of your tongue against the back, against your front teeth, the face will go normal. They'll do some graft with a glossopharyngeal nerve, with one of the tongue nerves, so that when this woman could put her tongue behind her front teeth, her face will go normal. As soon as she takes her tongue away, though, so she has a way, at least, of going out in public and having a normal-looking face. But these are kind of the traumas of eighth nerve pathology. It can be a real drag. It's like, whoa. This is not like just, oh, I've got hearing loss in my ear. This is kind of like, whoa. Now, you're looking at this. Tell me, can you see the page here now, Karen?
Yes.
Good stuff. So this is just notes as we finish this session for today. The internal auditory meatus is tiny. Retrocochlear means beyond the cochlea. Eighth nerve pathologies are almost unilateral. That's why asymmetrical sensory neural loss is always a red flag. The resultant sensory neural loss can vary widely in degree across the frequencies. It doesn't have to be a severe loss. It can be a mild loss. Usually very poor speech recognition in the affected ear. Sometimes ringing in the ear, tinnitus is present. The ABR is done by audiologists to differentially diagnose cochlear from retrocochlear. So that's how we finish today. Next week we'll start on central auditory nervous system. Now we will learn more about this stuff in disorders. In the summer, I teach a course, 125, hearing disorders. It's a short course, it's only 8 weeks, but one of the topics is retrocochlear pathology, of course. So we will cross this way again. But most of the stuff here you'll hear a second time, but we'll also talk a little bit more about retrocochlear pathology. But today we've covered the eighth nerve. Next week, I'd like to give you a nice little preview of, look at my CAT scan. Can you see this?
Just you.
Just me. Oh, here we go. Don't you love it when I do that? Okay, let's share a slide here again. Just you. Oh, gosh, don't look at me. How about now, Karen? Can you see this?
Yes.
Here. Here's my CAT scan. That's the top of my head working on down.
Right.
Here's my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Here's my baby some years ago. She was a cute little thing.
Yeah.
As she grew larger, she was profoundly mentally disabled. Her mind was about 3 months of age. She lived to be 23. They didn't think she'd make it to age 10. But they did lots of CAT scans on her brain, and you can see the abnormalities. We'll show you more next week, but here's an MRI. You can see the gray areas and the white areas.
All right.
Isn't that wild? Here you see, this is a CAT scan. I'll show you more next week, but here's an MRI again. You can see gray areas and white areas as you work your way down. So I won't spoil the show. We'll talk more about CAT scans and MRIs. I'll show you more of those next week. Anyway, it's been a slice. Live long and prosper. I'll stop recording now and let you get on about your day. Okay? Good stuff. Thanks for the reminders of when I'm showing and when I'm not. Couldn't do
no problem.
Good stuff. All righty.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.